Big Shaq's son went for a jog. Ended up in cuffs. No reason, no voice. But inside that police station, where stories are buried and names erased, Big Shaq's son didn't break, he turned silence into scripture. The wall he wrote on wasn't vandalism, it was revolution. And when Big Shaq walked through those doors, the system blinked. Big Shaq's son arrested for fitting a description. What he does inside the police station was shocking. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the moment truth carved its way into history. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun cracked over Brentwood like a slow exhale, casting long golden streaks across the sidewalks and the trimmed grass of Wilmore Park. It was the kind of day that made you forget how cold the world could get. Lorenzo Zoe O'Neal ran in rhythmic strides, his sneakers beating against the pavement like a soft drum line. Tall, lean, and composed, he moved like a man chasing clarity, not speed. The air was crisp, headphones deep in his ears, and the outside world was tuned down to a low murmur. His breath came steady. His routine was sacred. 4 miles before breakfast, every day without fail. A few dog walkers nodded as he passed. An older man tipped his coffee cup in quiet salute. Even without knowing his name, people could tell Zoo came from something solid. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Or maybe it was the subtle weight of his father's legacy trailing behind him. Big Shaq was a household name, but Zoe didn't run with fame in his stride. He ran for space, for silence, for the 1 hour he could exist without assumption. But assumptions were already forming. Down the road, 2 black and white cruisers turned the corner, slow and cautious. Their tires crunched the gravel near the edge of the park, and a voice crackled through one of their radios, low, clipped, and sure. Black male, athletic build, gray hoodie, possible suspect in Brentwood robbery, last seen near Wilmore Park. The officers locked eyes with the figure pacing across the path. Ziu didn't hear the sirens at first, not over the bassline in his headphones, or the rhythm of his own heartbeat. It wasn't until the sharp squawk of a loudspeaker cut across the air that he turned, confused, and saw them. "Stop where you are! Hands up!" The words struck like a slap. His steps stumbled, his arms instinctively spread in surrender, and the world slowed to a crawl. A woman nearby dropped her phone. A jogger froze mid-stride. So stood with wide eyes, his mouth opening in protest. But nothing came out. One cruiser skidded to a stop, and 2 officers lunged toward him with unspoken certainty. This wasn't a question. This was already a conclusion. They patted him down, pulled his arms behind his back, clicked the cuffs tight. He asked what was happening, but they weren't listening. "You match the description," one muttered without eye contact. Another asked where he was headed. He told them, "Just jogging." They smirked like they'd heard that one before. He was walked toward the cruiser, the metal of the cuffs cold against his wrists, and it was only then that the neighborhood began to move again. People watched but didn't speak. A woman holding a yoga mat stared, her brows furrowed but her lips sealed. A man on a bench took out his phone, but then thought better of it and put it away. No one asked if the cops were sure. No one asked if Zoe was okay. The doors of the cruiser opened, and the moment Zoe ducked his head to get in, something inside him fractured, quietly, but completely. The inside of the police car smelled like cold vinyl and old sweat. The cage between him and the front seats was scratched, marked by countless passengers who probably all looked a little like him. As the vehicle pulled away, Zoe's eyes darted around the interior, and for a second he thought about his father, Shaquille O'Neal, the man the world knew as a giant, with a laugh that filled arenas. But none of that mattered in this backseat. Here he was just another young black man in cuffs. They didn't tell him where they were taking him. They didn't need to. The city rolled by in slow motion. The palms blurred behind the dirty cruiser windows, and Zoe wondered how quickly this moment would spin into something permanent. He'd done nothing. Literally nothing. But there he was, being transported like a threat. He tried to calm himself, focusing on each breath, counting backward from 20. That's what his sister Madara had taught him when his anxiety got bad. But this wasn't just anxiety. This was dread, the kind that lives in your chest long after the moment passes. The cruiser stopped in front of the Brentwood precinct, an unremarkable brick building with a flickering American flag by the door. As they pulled him out, Zoe noticed a small crack on the steps leading inside. The detail stuck with him. Maybe because it looked like what this moment was doing to him, breaking something small but permanent. Inside, The desk sergeant looked up without recognition. The officer said, "Picked him up in the park. Matches the suspect from the call. No ID." The sergeant gave a slow nod, already moving to grab a pen. So spoke up, louder this time. "My name is Lorenzo O'Neal. My father is Shaquille O'Neal. I didn't do anything." The words hung in the air, useless. The sergeant glanced up with half surprise. "O'Neal?" The other officer shrugged. "Claims so. They didn't uncuff him." He was led down a hallway that felt colder than the rest of the building. Past closed doors and blurred nameplates. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their hum drilling into his skull. Finally, they ushered him into a holding cell. Small gray, with a bench bolted to the floor and a toilet in the corner. No windows. No clock. Just a camera high in the corner, its red light blinking silently. Sachan stared at the wall across from him. Time had no meaning in that room. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just sat still, feeling his breath slow to match the blink of the camera light. Somewhere far away, his phone buzzed unanswered in his gym bag. Somewhere else, his family was wondering why he hadn't checked in. But here, inside the system, Lorenzo O'Neal had already vanished into a story written by someone else. And the truth? The truth was that this wasn't new. This wasn't rare. It was just his turn. He leaned back against the concrete and whispered to no one, "I was just running laps." And still, the sirens had come. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind him, swallowing up the light from the hallway and replacing it with a dull, suffocating yellow glow. The intake room smelled of bleach and something older, something baked into the walls, like history that hadn't learned how to forget. Zoa stood still for a second, trying to read the room. The white-tiled floor, the steel benches, the fingerprint ink smudged on the edge of the desk. It was all designed to compress a person, to flatten out identity, until only suspicion remained. The officer escorting him barked commands like it was just another Tuesday. "Stand here. Hands flat. Face forward." Zoe complied without resistance. But inside, every cell in his body screamed. The man didn't even ask his name this time. He read it off a clipboard with a smirk, drawing out the syllables like a bad joke. "Lorenzo O'Neal. That O'Neal. You know, my kid had your dad's jersey when he was little." The other officer chuckled as he slid a tray of belongings across the counter. "Guess greatness don't run in the blood after all." Zoe said nothing. He wasn't here to educate them. He knew from years of whispered warnings and living room talks that this part of the script was already written. He was supposed to shrink to explain himself into acceptability, but something inside him had cracked in that back seat, and it wasn't going back together easily. They photographed him 3 angles, like he was auditioning for a role he never agreed to. Then came the fingerprinting, the metal toilet with no privacy, and the laces pulled from his sneakers. The cuffs stayed on until they were ready to escort him down another hallway that looked exactly like the last one. The processing officer never asked about the robbery. He didn't mention evidence. It was all routine movements choreographed for ghosts. In that moment, Zoe realized something hollow, but sharp. This wasn't about what he'd done. This was about what he represented. They sat him in a hard plastic chair inside a narrow room with no windows. The walls were covered with smudged fingerprints and scuff marks, ghosts of people who came before him and probably left with more damage than they came in with. Across from him sat a woman in a gray blazer, not quite a detective, but clearly not just an admin. She started the tape recorder even though she hadn't asked a question yet. "For record keeping," she said flatly. She asked his name, then asked if he had an alibi. He told her the truth. He was jogging, same road he took every morning, headphones in, minding his own business. She nodded but didn't write anything down. Her eyes flicked to a paper in front of her, and her voice dropped half an octave. "You understand you match a description?" Ziwo answered calmly. "No, ma'am. I don't." "What description?" She blinked once, twice, then moved on without replying. It was clear. She wasn't here to listen. She was here to process. Outside the room, officers passed the windowed hallway, and one stopped to look in. He raised an eyebrow, recognized So's face, and nudged his partner. They laughed softly, like they were watching a celebrity do something dumb on TV. One mimed a slam dunk with his hands. So saw it all. Every frame burned into his memory like acid on film. These men weren't curious about guilt or innocence. They were entertained. He wasn't a suspect. He was a spectacle. Back in the room, the woman asked about his father. Did Shaquille know he was here? Was Zoe one of the good ones? Zoe bit his tongue until the questions stopped sounding like questions. He gave answers clipped and calm, trying to avoid feeding into the stereotype that had landed him here in the first place. But with every word, his dignity frayed. He wasn't being interrogated. He was being measured against an invisible bar that kept moving. After what felt like hours, she stood and turned off the recorder. "That's all for now," she said, then left him alone. No apology, no explanation, just absence. A slow hum filled the silence, not from the room itself, but from inside Zoe's chest. A hum of injustice so deep it rattled his spine. He looked around, noting the small camera in the corner, blinking like a silent witness that never testified. He didn't know if his father had been called. He didn't know what time it was, but he knew, without a doubt, that the officers outside weren't rushing to correct the mistake. He was taken from that room and placed in a small holding cell, bare walls, a metal bench, and a buzzing fluorescent light that flickered at odd intervals. This was the space where accused people waited to become convicts or be forgotten. Zhu sat there, unmoving, watching the light buzz like a broken heartbeat. His mind flashed to his sister's graduation, to the lake trips with his cousins, to his father cooking ribs in the backyard, with jazz blasting from the speakers. None of those images fit in this cell. As he sat, the door opened briefly. A young officer, not more than 25, peeked in. He looked at Zoe, like he wanted to say something. Maybe to apologize, maybe to ask a question, but instead he just nodded and shut the door again. That brief moment of humanity didn't fix anything. It just made Zoe angrier, because it meant they all knew, and they were still letting it happen. Time slowed. Then it stalled. The camera light blinked on, and Zoe realized no one was coming. Not right away. The system didn't care that he was famous blood. The system didn't care that he was innocent. The system only cared that he fit something familiar. A pattern they could process without thinking. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the wall ahead. There was a scuff mark shaped like a shoe print halfway up the concrete. He stared at it like it might speak. Maybe someone had been here before him, kicked the wall in frustration. Maybe they'd been forgotten too. In that moment, Zoe didn't feel like an O'Neal. He didn't feel like an athlete. He didn't even feel like a person. He felt like a shadow boxed in by fluorescent light, waiting to be told what label they'd picked for him next. And the worst part? He wasn't even surprised. The ballroom shimmered in gold and white, filled with polished laughter and clinking champagne flutes. A jazz quartet played smooth in the corner, the air full of smiles meant to impress donors and executives. Big Shaq stood near the stage, dressed sharp in a dark tailored suit, but his mind was already drifting. He smiled when people asked for photos. He nodded when the mayor mentioned his name in a speech. But beneath the polished exterior, something was off. Something tugged at him from the inside, like a bass note out of tune, vibrating right in the center of his chest. It wasn't pain exactly, not the kind he knew from broken bones or twisted knees. This was deeper, heavier, a pressure behind his ribs, spreading like smoke. It didn't make sense. The event was going smoothly. Money was being raised for underprivileged schools, and his name was being praised every few minutes. But still, his hands kept twitching. His jaw clenched every time he blinked. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just nerves. He stepped away from the crowd, found a quiet corner behind the velvet curtains near the service doors, and pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over Zoe's name, the contact saved with a basketball emoji, and a crown. He tapped the call. 1 ring, 2. Voicemail. He tried again, this time pacing as he waited. Still no answer. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, despite the room being cool. He tried his daughter Maura. She picked up on the second ring. "You heard from Zoe today?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. She hesitated. "Not since early this morning." He went running. "Why?" Shaq swallowed. "He's not answering." "Call his friends. Text group. I want to know if anyone's seen him since he left the house." He hung up before she could respond, and started dialing Zoe's closest friends. 2 didn't pick up. 1 answered and said he hadn't seen Zoe since yesterday. Another said, "Thought he was working out this morning. Ain't he always in that park?" Shaq's stomach tightened. That park. Wilmore. His instincts didn't need confirmation. They were already screaming. He called home. No answer. He called Zoe again. Still voicemail. Every second stretched longer than the last. Just then Lucille O'Neal's name lit up on his screen. He answered before the first ring ended. "Baby," she said calmly, but with gravity in her voice. "What's going on?" "I can't find Zhao," he said flatly. "He's not answering. Nobody's seen him since he went running." There was a silence that lasted just long enough to feel sacred. Then Lucille spoke in a voice sharpened by generations of knowing. "When our boys disappear," she said, "it's never random. Trust that feeling, son." That was all he needed. Without another word, Shaq left the ballroom. No goodbyes, no explanations. He walked out into the Los Angeles sunlight, tore off the necktie that suddenly felt like a noose, and climbed into his black Escalade. The door slammed shut like the punctuation at the end of a sentence. As he started the engine, the weight in his chest grew into something undeniable. A voice inside him, old and primal, whispered truths he didn't want to believe. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he pulled into traffic. His mind raced back to every talk he'd had with Zoe about safety, about keeping his head down, about what to do if God forbid he ever ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what if Zoe hadn't done anything wrong? What if this wasn't about place or time but about appearance? He tried to keep his focus on the road, but memories kept barging in. He remembered being pulled over back in his college days. Before the fame, before the cameras, a white officer tapping the window with a flashlight and calling him boy, like it was a reflex. He remembered the feeling of being tall, strong, and completely powerless, and now that same system might have its grip on his son. He turned on the radio to silence his thoughts. But even the music felt hollow. He shut it off. The car roared beneath him as he pressed the gas harder. Brentwood wasn't far, but every red light felt like a test of his patience. He wasn't used to this kind of helplessness. On the court, he could change a game with one move. In business, he could close a deal with a phone call. But this wasn't a game. This was the world reminding him that even his legacy, his money, his fame, none of it could shield his son from being seen as a suspect. He passed Wilmore Park and slowed the car. It was quiet now, just a few joggers and dog walkers. No signs of squad cars, no flashing lights. He pulled over, stepped out, and scanned the area. Nothing out of place, nothing that screamed crime scene. But he knew his son, and he knew Zoe never missed a check-in. Something had gone down here, and it had gone down quiet. Back in the car, he started calling precincts, one by one, posing as a concerned parent at first. No records, no information. Some transferred him. Some brushed him off. One even asked, "You mean like the basketball player?" As if Zoe being a celebrity's son somehow made this less urgent. By the sixth call, his patience snapped. His voice dropped to a thunderous calm. "I'm Shaquille O'Neal. My son might be in custody somewhere in this city. And if I don't get a straight answer in 5 minutes, I'm calling every journalist I know." That got their attention. A hesitant voice on the other end said something vague about a young man being brought in for questioning. No charges filed. Might match the name, but they wouldn't confirm it was Zoe. "You'll have to come down and speak to the desk sergeant," the officer said. Shaq didn't reply. He just hung up, shifted the car into drive, and floored it. His heart thundered louder with each passing block. His fingers gripped the wheel like it was the only thing anchoring him. He didn't know what he'd find when he got there. But he knew this. His son was not going to be another headline. Not another black boy locked up on paper-thin suspicion, forgotten in some holding cell while people argued over policy. The Escalade roared through the intersections of West LA, and in the rearview mirror, the city skyline blinked like it knew something he didn't. Shaq wasn't just a father heading to a precinct. He was a storm gathering in real time. The holding cell was no larger than a utility closet, and just as lifeless, the air hung heavy, stale from recycled breath and forgotten hours. The concrete walls were cold and blank, save for a few scratches where previous occupants had lost their temper or their patience. Lorenzo Zoe O'Neal sat on the metal bench, hands folded, eyes unmoving, locked on a crack running through the corner of the wall. He hadn't been told anything, not how long he'd be held, not what he was being accused of, not even if someone had been notified. Time in here didn't tick. It pulsed, slow and punishing. The anger was still there, but it had simmered into something sharper. Zoe wasn't about to beg. He wasn't about to scream for help. That was what they wanted to provoke him, to strip him down to the stereotype they had already printed in their minds. Instead, he breathed deeply, replaying the moment they shoved him into the cruiser, the way their faces said guilt before they even asked a question. The cuffs had left a thin red ring around his wrists. His muscles still ached from being yanked and manhandled. But what burned more was the silence that followed. He looked up toward the small vent in the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the building. Through that sound, he imagined people walking past, officers filling reports, vending machines dropping snacks in nearby hallways. Life going on while he sat in this forgotten corner of the precinct. That's when something clicked in his chest. Not rage, not despair, something deeper. A refusal to be silent, a refusal to be erased. Zoe leaned down and removed his left shoe. Inside the tongue tucked under the foam liner was a small, dull paperclip he always kept hidden, a habit his sister once taught him to lock up secrets in journals. It wasn't sharp, barely capable of scratching plastic, but it was enough. He stood slowly, walked over to the wall, and began etching. The paperclip dragged against the concrete like chalk on sandpaper. It didn't make a lot of noise, but it carved deep enough to leave a mark. Not art, not graffiti, words, thought, truth. He wrote in all caps, his strokes slow and steady, every line a punch, a protest, a declaration. It began with the obvious. I wasn't running from anyone. I was running for me. Then it got heavier. I don't fit your description. You fit the problem. And more. If I look like a threat to you, maybe you've been taught to fear the wrong things. He kept going. Every sentence bled into the next. There was no room for flowery language. This wasn't about poetry. This was about exposure. Raw, stripped-down truth. The kind that forces people to look at what they're complicit in. From behind the mirrored glass, Detective Wynn watched in silence. He hadn't said a word since being told Zoe was in custody. A veteran on the force, Wynn had seen enough over 2 decades to know when something smelled wrong. The report was vague, the arrest paperwork thinner than a coffee receipt, and no body cam footage had been submitted. That alone raised red flags. But now, watching this kid with his back turned to the camera, writing like his soul depended on it, Wynn felt something in his chest twitch. At first, he thought it was youthful defiance, maybe even attention-seeking. But after 5 minutes of watching Zoe write without pause, he stepped closer to the glass. He squinted through the one-way mirror and read the sentences beginning to form on the cell wall. They don't see a kid. They see a record waiting to happen. No matter what I do right, I'll always be your wrong color in the right neighborhood. The words cut deep. Wynn had seen kids lash out before. Yelling, punching walls, collapsing into tears. But this was different. This wasn't chaos. This was clarity, purposeful, controlled, and far more dangerous to the system than any outburst. A young officer passed by and noticed Wynn standing still. Problem? He asked casually. Wynn shook his head. Just observing. You want me to stop him? The officer offered, a hint of amusement in his voice. He's marking up the wall like he thinks he's Banksy or something. Wynn didn't look away. No. Let him finish. The officer shrugged and walked off, clueless to the quiet revolution happening behind that reinforced door. Inside the cell, Zoe sat back down, his arms sore from scraping the wall. He stared at what he'd written. The words weren't perfect, but they were his truth, his voice, unfiltered. This wall, once a symbol of confinement, was now a journal, a protest, a mural of memory and warning. He added one final line at the bottom. The words etched so slowly they looked burned into the stone. You can erase me from the system, but not from the story. He dropped the paperclip into the corner, folded his arms, and leaned back against the bench. The act was finished. But the echo had just begun. In the observation room, Wynn pulled out his phone and snapped a quick photo through the glass. He wasn't sure why, maybe for record, maybe for conscience. Something in those words reminded him of the boy he used to be before the badge, a time when the world still treated him like a threat before giving him a chance to speak. He stared at the image on his phone, the wall text glaring back at him, like it had been waiting for someone to read it. His jaw tightened. His fingers hovered over the send button, unsure whether to forward it to internal affairs or keep it as a quiet spark inside him. Either way, the impact was real. In that moment, 2 truths existed at once. Inside the cell was a young man treated like a file number, yet refusing to be reduced. Outside, behind the glass, was an officer torn between the system he worked for and the justice he once believed in. The wall would be cleaned eventually. They'd try to cover the words with fresh paint, bury the message under bureaucracy. But what Zoe had done couldn't be undone. Because sometimes, the loudest rebellion doesn't sound like fists or fire. Sometimes it sounds like quiet scratching on concrete. And behind that locked door, with nothing but a dull paperclip and the fire in his chest, Zoe had written something that couldn't be ignored. The Brentwood precinct looked small from the outside, but inside it was a maze of narrow hallways and doors designed to confuse and control. Shaq's footsteps echoed across the polished linoleum floor as he entered, his size swallowing the space, but it wasn't just his stature that shifted the room. It was the heat he carried in his silence. His presence wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Heads turned, phones stopped mid-ring, conversations died in throats. The front desk officer looked up with the kind of uncertainty reserved for celebrities and threats, not knowing yet which one he was facing. "I'm looking for my son, Lorenzo O'Neal," Shaq said, voice low but anchored in warning. The words were clipped, professional, yet pulsing beneath them was an unmistakable edge, the kind you hear just before a wall gives out. The officer blinked, then forced a smile. "We don't have anyone by that name in our system, sir." Shaq leaned in slightly. "Try again." The officer hesitated, typing something on his terminal, pretending to search. He shook his head again. "No record. Are you sure he was brought here?" Shaq's jaw flexed. "He went missing over 5 hours ago, last seen in Wilmore Park, jogging. A young black man. He was detained. You know he was brought here. Don't lie to me." The desk sergeant gave a tight-lipped shrug, shifting in his seat. "Sir, we'd know if he was in custody." The room tensed. Everyone nearby tried to pretend they weren't watching. But they were. Shaq could feel the stillness settle around him. A quiet dread. It wasn't just the fear of a father. It was the memory of being a young black man himself, standing in precincts just like this one, trying to prove his right to exist. Then, from a side hallway came a voice Shaq hadn't heard in over 2 decades. "Shaquille O'Neal," the man said, smooth, practiced, and laced with something colder than respect. "Didn't expect to see you walk through my doors again." Shaq turned slowly. There he was, Captain Dean Reed, gray hair now, uniform pressed to perfection. Same eyes though, sharp, calculating, proud, and Shaq remembered. He remembered Reed's hand on a holstered gun outside that dorm room. His sophomore year, he remembered Reed's tone, as he barked questions that night, asking if the stereo in Shaq's room was stolen because that model doesn't belong to college kids from the East Side. Reed had never apologized. He never needed to. Power never did. And now here he was, standing in front of the man's son, pretending not to see the pattern repeating. Shaq didn't smile. Didn't blink. "You have my son back there, don't you?" Reed gave a thin grin. "If we had him, I'd know. And we don't. Maybe he just skipped town. Ever think of that?" Shaq stepped forward, towering, but not intimidating, not physically. It was his silence that pressed against the walls. "Don't play with me, Dean. You remember what you almost did to me when I was 19, gun drawn, shouting before asking a single question. I didn't run then. My son didn't run now." Reed's grin faltered. Shaq continued, slower now, each word grounded like a building foundation. "Don't let my son vanish like I almost did. Because this time, I won't walk away quiet." The air changed. The front desk officer looked down, suddenly busy with a blank screen. A young patrolman walking by stopped to listen, then thought better and moved on. It wasn't a scene, it was something worse. It was truth pressing up through the floor, cracking everything around it. Reed's face tightened. "I suggest you calm down. I suggest you check the holding records again," Shaq said. "Because if you think I'm walking out of here while my son's in some cell with no name, you don't remember who I am, or what I'm willing to do for him." Behind the calm in his voice, Shaq was unraveling. Not out of fear, but from the helplessness that threaded every inch of this place. The knowledge that somewhere in the back, his boy was sitting alone, being treated like a suspect instead of a son. The worst part was knowing that the same system that once targeted him had only gotten more subtle, more efficient. Now it erased names, instead of lives, but the result was the same. Reed looked toward a uniformed officer standing near the records office, then gave a slight nod. The man disappeared through a door, and a moment later, came back whispering something into Reed's ear. Reed's face didn't move, but his eyes shifted. He turned to Shaq. "We may have a John Doe who might match the description. Brought in by officers responding to a call. Said he didn't have ID." "He did," Shaq snapped. "It was in his gym bag. And you knew that." Reed didn't answer. Not with words. just turned slightly, motioning for Shaq to follow. As they walked down the hallway, past cubicles and closed doors, Shaq noticed something else: faces of officers who refused to meet his gaze, eyes that flicked away, ears that heard every word but mouths that stayed shut. They stopped in front of a door marked Interview 2. Reed gestured toward the glass. Shaq looked in, expecting to see his son, but the room was empty. "He was here," Reed said quietly. "We're confirming where he was moved. It's standard. If he didn't give us his name, he might have been rerouted to central processing." Shaq took a step closer. "You moved him without telling anyone?" "It's policy," Reed said. "It's just the system, Shaq." Shaq's jaw locked. "The system," he echoed, voice ice. "The same one that trained you to look at me like a criminal before I even said a word. And now you're telling me it did the same to my son." For a second, something flickered in Reed's eyes. Maybe guilt. Maybe it was just the weight of being seen for what he was. Then, like a man slipping back into a mask, Reed said, "We'll find him. You have my word." Shaq stepped back. "Your word is how we got here." And with that he turned, walking out of the hallway, out of the room, but not out of the fight. Because now, it wasn't just about finding his son. It was about making sure this time someone answered for it. An hour later, the post hit TikTok, then Instagram, then Twitter. At first just a few people shared it, then a few thousand. The photo of Zoe's words, bold, scratched into the cement with jagged precision, captured something that couldn't be explained, only felt. One sentence especially took hold: "You can erase me from the system, but not from the story." By nightfall, it had been retweeted over 80,000 times. Journalists started calling precincts, asking for confirmation. LAPD offered none. Someone leaked Zoe's full name. Others recognized it immediately. Big Shaq's son, a college-bound athlete, not a suspect, not a criminal, just another young black man, with the wrong look at the wrong time. Inside the O'Neal mansion, Mewara stood barefoot in the kitchen, her phone buzzing on the counter. She scrolled through her feed absently, until she saw it. The photo of the wall, then the name, her brother's name. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed a hand to her chest, as if it might slow the heartbeat now, stampeding inside her. The caption was short, but the implications were massive. He was there, he was alive, but no one had called, no one had said a word, and now strangers on the internet knew more about her brother's status than his own family. She dropped the phone and gripped the counter. The marble edge dug into her palms, but she didn't move. The tears came fast, hot, and unfiltered. Not just from fear, but from rage. How many times had they talked about this? How many times had they played out these very scenarios in hushed voices over dinner, hoping they'd never become real? Upstairs, Lucille sat in a chair near the window, watching the yard lights flicker on one by one. She felt it too, the shift, the buzz of something rising beyond the family's reach. She turned on the TV just in time to see Zoe's face pop up on the late-night news, followed by a blurred image of the wall text and the now viral hashtags. Zoo Neal. Fit the description. Run while black. Reporters hadn't confirmed anything. No comment from LAPD. No legal reps. No press releases. But the people were already reacting. Injustice doesn't wait for permission. At the precinct, officers were starting to realize they had a problem. Not a legal one yet, but a public one. The phones were ringing more often. The front desk buzzed with media requests. And inside the command center, Captain Reed stared at a screen showing the wall photo, his face pale. He hadn't expected this. Not from a quiet kid. Not from a mistake they thought could be erased with a technicality. He ordered the post taken down from all official precinct channels, then barked at a lieutenant to find Zoe's exact location. "I want him transferred quietly. Now." Meanwhile, Shaq stood in the parking lot outside the station, phone pressed to his ear. His attorney was on the line, shouting over the chaos of media calls and legal maneuvering. But Shaq wasn't listening to any of it. His eyes were glued to the same photo, the same wall, his son's words, etched into concrete, now etched into the soul of the internet. He lowered the phone. Around him, reporters began gathering behind the barricades, cameras rolling. One of them yelled his name, asking for a comment. Shaq didn't move, didn't speak. His fists were clenched at his sides, not in anger, but to keep from unraveling. Because this wasn't just a father's fear anymore. It was a realization, The fight he'd spent his life preparing Zoe for had finally arrived, and his son had stepped into it with nothing but truth and a paperclip. Back in the holding cell, Zoe sat still, unaware of the fire he'd lit. He didn't know about the posts, or the hashtags, or the fact that his name was now trending globally. All he knew was that the room felt different. The tension in the air was no longer just his. The officers had stopped looking him in the eye. One had even called him Mr. O'Neal like he suddenly deserved respect. The shift wasn't complete. The system hadn't budged yet, but it had blinked. And that was enough for now. Because while the police station moved slowly, trying to cover its tracks, the outside world had already made up its mind. The truth wasn't waiting for permission anymore. It had already gone viral. And somewhere behind every screen, someone was reading that wall for the first time, and seeing it as scripture. The precinct walls held secrets, but none more dangerous than the ones people pretended weren't there. Behind the uniformed silence and polished reports, something foul was festering, something even the most loyal officers could feel in their gut, but didn't dare speak aloud. Until one day, Detective Wynn sat at his desk reviewing Zoe's arrest details for the third time, and nothing added up. The intake file had vanished from the system. No digital trail, no signature, no timestamp, just a phantom entry that had apparently never existed. And yet Wynn had seen Zoe walk into this building. He had read the name himself on a paper log before it disappeared. He had watched the boy scratch truth into concrete like it was scripture. That kid was real. His arrest? It was being erased in real time. A knock interrupted the thick silence. A young patrol officer, rookie by his look, nervous by his fidgeting, stepped in and shut the door behind him. His eyes darted to the blinds, then to Wynn. "I shouldn't be in here," the rookie started, voice low. "But I saw what they did." Wynn leaned back in his chair. "Slow down. I was on desk duty during the arrest. Lorenzo O'Neal was brought in. No booking photo, no fingerprint entry. One of the sergeants said to process it off the books, said it was sensitive. A few hours later, his file disappeared from the system. Body cam from the patrol unit that picked him up, gone. The drive was wiped." Wynn's eyes narrowed. "You're sure?" "I saw the footage myself," the rookie said. He didn't resist. He asked questions, calm. They cuffed him anyway. Then later the footage just gone. It's like it never happened. Wynn sat still, gears turning behind his quiet stare. This wasn't laziness. This was strategic. Someone was moving pieces. Not just ignoring protocol, but rewriting history. His badge suddenly felt heavier on his chest. "You said the sergeant called it sensitive?" "Who told him that?" The rookie hesitated. "He said it came from Captain Reed." There it was. The rot had a name. Wynn thanked the officer and told him to keep quiet. The kid nodded once, then slipped out the door like a ghost. Wynn stared at the blank screen in front of him, his mind churning through memories and connections. He'd worked with Reed for years. The man was sharp, always too polished, too perfect on the outside. But Wynn had seen his tells, the way his voice flattened when lying, the way he weaponized policy like a shield. This wasn't a mistake. It was a maneuver. And now the department was protecting itself, layer by layer. Wynn knew what this meant. To speak up was to invite exile. To challenge it from within was to risk being buried under red tape, or worse. But silence was no longer an option. He printed what few fragments he could salvage. Za's intake timestamp from the precinct's internal door log, a clipped radio call that matched the patrol's route to Wilmore Park, and a partial clip from a hallway camera showing Zao being escorted to holding. Not enough to break a system, but enough to force a crack. He slipped the papers into an unmarked envelope, locked it in his desk drawer, and stood. In the captain's office, Reed stared at his own screen, scrolling through a live feed of social media outrage. The wall text had been picked up by national outlets. Commentators were already questioning the department's failure to notify the family. He cursed under his breath. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about optics. Control. He picked up the desk phone and barked orders. "Move the kid. I don't care how. Do it quietly. Get him out of this building before a lawyer shows up. Transport him to central processing. No paper trail." The officer on the other end stammered, but agreed. Reed hung up and took a slow breath. He had dealt with backlash before, but not like this. Not with cameras circling, and a celebrity father already breathing fire in his lobby. If So stayed, more people would talk. If So was gone, This would fade. Just another trending hashtag that people would forget in a week. But Reed didn't know Shaq had already started moving. After catching wind of the online posts and the whispers from within the station, Shaq had slipped away quietly, climbing into his Escalade and blending into the chaos of city traffic. He'd learned the precinct was preparing a quiet transfer. Someone tipped him off. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Loyalty came in unexpected places. Now he sat behind the wheel, parked down the block from the rear garage, eyes on the service entrance. He hadn't told anyone, not even Lucille, not yet, because what he was doing wasn't just about recovery. It was about exposure. If they thought they could make his son disappear again, they were about to learn the O'Neals weren't built for silence. He watched as an unmarked transport van pulled out from the underground lot. 2 officers in the front, tinted windows, no ID plates, just plain white steel and intention. Shaq shifted gears and followed. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, Wynn stood outside Reed's office. He didn't knock, just walked in. Reed looked up, annoyed, but Wynn didn't flinch. "You moved the boy," Wynn said. Reed's jaw tightened. "He's being processed properly now." "You mean hidden?" "I'm protecting the department," Reed said flatly. "We don't need this PR disaster getting worse." Wynn stepped closer, lowering his voice. "He was never processed. His footage was deleted. You're not cleaning up a mess. You're burying the truth." Reed stood slowly. "You want to go on record with that? You better be sure. Because if you're wrong, I'm not." The 2 men stood eye to eye. Decades of experience between them. But 2 very different codes. Reed's was built on hierarchy. Wynn's had begun to erode the moment he read the words. Zoe had carved into the wall. Something had shifted inside him. Permanently. Reed leaned back, dismissive. "Then do what you have to do." Wynn turned without another word. He didn't slam the door. He didn't threaten. He just walked out, already composing the email, in his head. The Internal Affairs address. The DA. The media, if it came to that. Someone would listen. Someone had to. Back in traffic. Shaq followed the van through the sprawl of West LA, his hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes locked on the taillights. He didn't know where they were headed, but it didn't matter. He was done waiting for the system to deliver justice. Now, he was chasing it himself. The sun had dipped behind a wall of smog-streaked clouds as the white transport van rolled through the industrial edge of South LA, cruising toward an isolated intake center that looked more like a shipping warehouse than a government facility. There were no signs, no flags, no welcoming lights, just chain-link fencing, floodlights, and silence. The kind of place you don't notice until it's too late. The kind of place where things people go to disappear in paperwork. But this time the system hadn't planned on Shaquille O'Neal. He was already there, parked off to the side in a matte black Escalade. Engine humming low, windows down just enough to let him hear the crunch of tires approaching. He'd tracked the van through 5 turns, 2 sudden lane changes, and 1 detour that looked more like a stall than a route. But he hadn't flinched. He hadn't called ahead. He'd just followed, quiet as thunder before a storm. Now, as the van rolled up the cracked asphalt toward the fenced entryway, Shaq stepped out. He didn't rush, didn't run, just moved into the center of the lot, his feet solid on the ground, like he belonged there. And when the headlights hit him, casting his massive silhouette across the pavement, the van stopped, not because it had to, but because something about the way he stood said, "You're going to listen." 2 officers stepped out of the cab, hands moving toward radios. One began barking orders, waving Shaq back, telling him this was restricted property. Shaq didn't move. He lifted his chin and spoke. Loud enough to fill the lot, low enough to shake the air. "You're not moving that van until I see my son." The younger officer hesitated, eyes wide, half expecting backup to come pouring in from the shadows. But the shadows were empty. The other officer stepped forward, voice clipped with protocol. "Sir, you need to vacate the premises, or we will be forced." Shaq raised a hand. Not to threaten, to silence. "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm demanding a right." Before the officer could respond, the rhythmic chop of helicopter blades broke across the sky. Then another. The first news chopper swooped in from the north, its spotlight sweeping over the van, then pausing on Shaq. Reporters in the cabin were already broadcasting live. They'd followed the noise from social media and scanner leaks, tailing the digital scent of injustice. And now they had their shot. Shaquille O'Neal standing between the system and his son. Inside the van, Zoe sat cuffed to a metal anchor, welded to the floor. His legs were asleep, but his mind was racing. He couldn't see what was happening, but he heard the rotors. He heard the shouting, and then, faint but unmistakable, he heard his father's voice, steady, immovable. "Let me see him." Back on the ground, officers scrambled to block the view. One step toward Shaq again, hand brushing the edge of his holster, not drawing, but posturing. Shaq's eyes dropped to the movement, then rose again, calm, focused, furious in the most controlled way a man could be. "I'm not here to fight you," he said. "I'm here to stop you from making a mistake you won't come back from." Across the country, the moment was already going viral. Live streams exploded on every platform. News outlets scrambled to frame the event, unsure if this was a protest, an ambush, or something else entirely. Commentators debated live whether this was obstruction or justice in motion. Then came Lucille, broadcasting from a local studio. Her interview had just gone live. The host asked her what message she had for the LAPD, and Lucille, dressed in quiet grace and steel resolve, leaned forward and delivered a single sentence that cracked through every screen in America. "Black boys don't vanish, they get erased. My son won't let that happen to his son." The host blinked. The control room fell silent, and the nation leaned in. At the intake center, the chopper camera captured Shaq staring down the officer, waiting. Then, without warning, the van door cracked open. Zoe stepped down slowly, escorted by a third officer who looked more nervous than aggressive. His wrists were still cuffed. His hoodie streaked with sweat and dust, but he walked tall, the way his father had taught him, shoulders back, chin high. Even with shackles on his wrists, he looked more free than anyone else in that lot. The moment their eyes met, Shaq exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for hours. Zoe gave him a nod of gratitude, not of desperation, of recognition. They were in this together. A reporter on the ground shouted a question. Another raised a mic, but no one answered. The noise was irrelevant now. Shaq looked at the officer nearest to Zoe. "Take the cuffs off, now." There was hesitation, then compliance. The officer knelt and unlocked the restraints. Zoe rubbed his wrists, flexed his fingers, then stepped beside his father. They didn't embrace. Not yet. The moment wasn't over. A fourth officer stepped out of the building, phone in hand. He walked toward the group with cautious authority and whispered something to the ranking officer. They huddled briefly, then nodded. The original transport order was canceled on the spot. Shaq put his hand on Zoe's shoulder and guided him toward the escalade. Not fast, not furtive, just firm. Like walking out of a place you were never supposed to be, in the first place. The cameras rolled. The spotlight tracked them. The air throbbed with a silence so loud it bent the sky. They reached the car, and just before Zoe climbed in, he turned back to the reporters. He didn't speak. He just raised his arms, wrist bones bare now, and held them open, like a man showing scars that hadn't even healed yet. Shaq looked back once, locking eyes with the officer who had nearly ordered his son into the system's depths. He didn't smile, didn't threaten. He just stared, and somehow that silence hit harder than any speech. Then they were gone. The lot slowly emptied. Officers returned to their posts. Cameras packed away. But something irreversible had taken place. A father had stood where the system told him not to. A son had walked out without shame, and the world had watched it unfold in real time. The silence had been broken, and it wasn't going back. The sun hadn't fully returned yet. Its light still filtered through gray smog, hesitant, unsure how to shine on the aftermath of everything that had just erupted. But Lorenzo O'Neal didn't wait for the perfect moment. He stepped out of the Escalade before his father could even round the front of the vehicle. His cuffs were gone, but the red marks around his wrists were fresh, unhidden. His sweatshirt clung to him, worn and creased, bearing the weight of hours spent in silence. His face held no smile, no tremble. He wasn't there to celebrate his release. He wasn't free yet, not in the way that mattered. Cameras swiveled like radar, sensing motion. Microphones were hoisted into the air like offerings. The reporters had followed the van. They'd caught the moment Shaq blocked its path. They'd seen the quiet showdown that wasn't supposed to happen. But now, as Zoe stood in front of them, they realized the story hadn't ended. It was just beginning. He didn't wait for questions. He didn't look at his father for permission. He walked toward the crowd until the cameras formed a semicircle around him. The city behind them, the system still looming behind him. And then he spoke. "It was jogging," he said. His voice didn't shout. It cracked. But not from fear. From fire. "That's it. Jogging. Headphones in. AirPods. The kind you can't hear the world through." The crowd held its breath. Shaq stood back, arms crossed, eyes locked on his son, not guiding, not guarding, just witnessing. "They didn't ask me anything," Zoe continued. "Didn't check ID. Didn't slow down. They pulled up fast, 3 cars, lights, noise, and assumptions. I was told I fit the description. That was all they needed." A murmur moved through the crowd. Soft at first. Camera operators adjusted focus. Reporters scribbled notes, but mostly just stared. Zoe's hands hung at his sides, still bruised, still raw, but they didn't shake. "I didn't fight them," he said. "But I did something else. I wrote. On that wall. With a paperclip. Because when they take your voice, you carve it back." He paused, lifted his gaze to meet the lens of a central news camera. Somewhere in that moment, the air shifted. The crowd stopped seeing a kid. They saw something larger, something rising. "I wrote the truth on that wall," Zoe said. "And I'm gonna say it again now, out loud, so they can't paint over it." He took a breath. "I said, you can erase me from the system but not from the story." The crowd ignited, not in cheers, but in sound. People gasped. People clapped. Some cried. Silently, behind sunglasses. The camera flashes felt less invasive, and more like confirmation. This was real. This was happening. And it couldn't be undone. Inside the precinct, behind shaded glass, Detective Wynn sat at his desk one last time. In front of him sat the envelope he'd prepared, the one filled with copies of deleted logs, timestamped surveillance stills, and a signed statement from the rookie officer who'd told the truth. Wynn hadn't been loud about it. He didn't need a parade, just the weight of doing what was right. He stood, slid the envelope into a folder marked "to D only," and left it on the assistant district attorney's desk in a sealed courier bag. Then he wrote a single line on a sticky note, pressed it to his monitor, and walked out. "Silence is complicity. Consider this my resignation." Back outside, Zoe kept speaking, not like a politician, not like a preacher, but like someone who'd seen the other side of something people don't always come back from. "They asked me nothing," he said, "because they already decided who I was. Not based on what I'd done, but how I looked, where I was, what I represented." His fingers tapped at the front of his hoodie, near his chest. "This," he said, "this is where it happens. The judgment, the assumptions, the erasure. But I want them to know something. They can't unwrite what I carved. It's in the world now." Behind him, Mara stood near Lucille, who had arrived quietly, holding her granddaughter's hand. Lucille wasn't crying. She was nodding, her lips tight, eyes wet. She'd seen this story too many times. But never like this. Never with a microphone in her grandson's hand. "I'm not asking for pity," Zoe said. "I'm demanding clarity. What happened to me isn't new. It didn't start with me, but it has to stop with someone." He turned slightly, looking into every camera now. "And if it can happen to me, son of a man you all cheer for, brother to a girl you follow on TikTok, what do you think happens to the boys with no spotlight? With no camera?" That question lingered. In living rooms across the country, viewers sat upright. On city buses, phones lit up. At kitchen tables, parents paused and listened with their children. Something had broken. Something had split wide open. Back at the precinct, Reed stood in his office, watching the feed on a muted monitor. His face was unreadable, but his legacy was shifting beneath him. He could feel it. The kind of change you don't stop with a memo or a press release. The kind that comes when the truth walks out the front door, wearing bruises and turns them into banners. Zoe lowered his voice now, but it didn't lose power. "They locked me up for jogging," he said. "But I'm not staying locked in anyone's narrative. I'm not your fit the description story. I'm the rewrite." Then he turned, walked back toward his family. This time, they embraced him, not because he was broken, but because he had broken something else. And as the cameras kept rolling, as the internet flooded with clips, as the air thickened with calls for accountability, one thing became clear. Zoe hadn't been crushed by the system. He had cracked it, and everyone heard the sound. 2 weeks after the world watched him speak his truth, Lorenzo Zoe O'Neal walked through the front doors of the Brentwood precinct again. This time his stride was calm. No shackles, no shadows trailing him, No patrol cars pulling up behind. Just him, his father beside him, and a bucket of paint held between them. It wasn't a stunt. It wasn't spectacle. They hadn't told the media. They didn't need to. This wasn't for cameras. It was for closure. Shaq carried the brush, but Zoe held the purpose. The hallway looked different now. Quieter. The tension that once sat in the air like fog had thinned. Most of the officers they passed looked down. Some nodded faintly. A few offered stares longer than necessary, but none dared to stop them. The captain's office was empty, the nameplate for Reed already removed. No official announcement had been made yet, but the resignation had circulated like wildfire. Reed had quietly stepped down, and while the internal memos cited retirement, the city knew better. At the end of the hallway, near the processing wing, the holding cell still sat closed, but it wasn't forgotten. The wall was still there. Not painted over. Not scraped clean. Instead, it had been preserved, encased in a clear plexiglass frame, sealed against time. Zoe's words remained exactly as he carved them. Every jagged letter, every chiseled truth. But above it now was a bronze plate, freshly mounted, with an inscription that read, "Let the wall speak where silence once ruled." Carved by Lorenzo O'Neal. Zoe stopped in front of it, breath caught in his chest. He hadn't known. The plan had been simple. Come back, repaint, close the loop. But someone inside the department, someone who still believed in redemption, had chosen otherwise. The wall had become a memorial, not to trauma, but to truth. He stared at the words, some of them uneven, scratched in anger and hope. His eyes landed on the one line that had spread the fastest, the one etched deepest. "You can erase me from the system, but not from the story." He felt Shaq step beside him, the man who had once stared down an entire department just to make sure his son didn't disappear. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Sometimes the silence between men says more than words ever could. Ziu finally set the paint bucket down at the base of the wall, untouched. The brush stayed dry, and with it the past remained visible. Not as a scar, but as a landmark. They turned and walked back down the hallway. A few feet from the front desk, Shaq paused and looked at the officer on duty. "Tell your new chief," he said quietly. This was the right choice. The officer nodded once, unsure what to say. Respect wasn't something you spoke in that moment. It was something you stood still for. Outside, the sky had cleared just enough to let in a full wash of California light. The Escalade sat waiting. But So didn't get in right away. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a thick folder, tucked under his arm like a baton in a relay. It was an enrollment packet from UCLA's School of Criminology and Law. He'd submitted it 3 days after stepping out of that van. No interviews, no delay, just a decision made from the deepest part of himself. He wasn't just going to survive the system. He was going to study it, walk into it with eyes wide open, break it from the inside, fix it, if he could. Shaq looked down at the folder, then back at his son. There was a weight to his expression, but it wasn't sadness. It was pride built on fear, on memories, on knowing how close he'd once come to being erased himself. He opened his arms and pulled Zoe in, not fast, not tight, but full. Not just as a father, but as a man seeing another man rise from the place where others are broken. "You sure about this?" he asked softly. Zoe nodded. "More than I've ever been about anything." They stood there, the city buzzing in the distance. A new world forming quietly behind the headlines. Beneath the hashtags. Inside the station, Detective Wynn's old desk was now empty. His evidence had reached the DA's office. Internal Affairs had opened inquiries. A slow tremor had begun to ripple through the department. Not a quake, not a collapse, but a warning. The system may not bend quickly, but now it knew it could no longer move without being watched. The precinct itself, once a fortress of silence, had changed. A few new hires, some fresh training protocols. One officer anonymously funded a mural to go up in the community center a few blocks away. Zaw's wall, reimagined with his words painted in vibrant color across a basketball court fence. Back at home, Lucille was already setting the dinner table. Mira had texted Zoe 3 times that morning, telling him he better speak at her graduation next year. "You're basically a civil rights icon now," she joked. But behind the joke was something truer, admiration. Unshaken. And in homes across the country, screenshots of Zoe's wall still hung on fridges, corkboards, and classroom doors. Teachers used it to start conversations. Parents read it to their children. Activists etched it onto posters. Artists printed it on canvas. Because the wall hadn't stayed in the precinct. It had moved into people's consciousness. Shaq leaned against the SUV, watching Zoe as he looked around, absorbing the moment. "You wrote your way out," he said quietly. "That's something I never learned to do." Zoe looked up. "You gave me the strength to. I just found my way." And then, as the wind picked up and carried the smell of city concrete and spring warmth, Zoe looked forward, not at the station, not at the cameras that had once followed him, but toward what came next. He whispered one final thought, not to anyone in particular, but maybe to himself. They saw a threat. I became a voice. And that, more than anything, was the ending no one saw coming. Because the wall came down.
But the writing?
The writing stayed. If this story shook something in you, don't let that feeling fade. Channel it. Start the conversations they avoid. Teach the truth they bury. Remember, Zoe's wall wasn't just a message. It was a mirror. Now ask yourself, when it's your turn to stand, will you? Because change doesn't start with systems. It starts with people who refuse to stay silent.